Dr. Gurpur is also a recipient of Fulbright-Nehru International Education Scholarship in 2011 and is a distinguished academician who has been a recipient of the National and South Asian Legal Education Innovation Award 2011, conferred by SILF and MILAT. She has also been the member of the 19th Law Commission of India and also the member of the Bar Council of India. Now, I'd like to introduce the guest speakers as well. That is, first one being Ms. Kalki Subramaniam. Now, Ms. Kalki is a transgender rights activist, artist, actress, writer, inspirational speaker, and an entrepreneur from Tamil Nadu. And going to Ms. Nadika Nadja. She is a writer and communications professional with diverse subject interests, including but not limited to history, archaeology, gender queerness, politics, and Tamil. I hope everybody is doing well here virtually and is safe and protected from the unfortunate spread of this pandemic. And I also thank Gurpur ma'am for blessing us with such a space to conduct sessions like these. Now, when I say important, it must be noted that it has taken us all as a society a good amount of time to recognize the rights of queer people as something to be debated, to draw conclusions and work towards a betterment. Several legislations down in the history of global legal trends has directed us to believe many things, that queer people either don't deserve rights or simply must be erased from existence. But as we dawned into the glorious, gayest, and the most colorful century of the modern human history, definitely looking over the golden period for queer people centuries ago, we have come to realize the sheer weight of contributory power that lies within this community. If that's the case, why are queer people not given their share of rights and have to demand, beg, and moreover strip their dignity to prove their realness, ask for constitutional protection over and over again, only to fall on deaf and privileged ears? This seminar happens to tackle exactly that, specifically the constitutional validity of the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. I apologize. From our entertainment industry grossly misrepresenting them, to politics using them as a vote bank scheme, or to police and public brutality and harassment of all kinds. Why is that? Despite laws established to protect the community, the legal system brushes the collective pain under the red carpet. Hopefully, through this session, we may be able to derive the armor we need to legally protect and assimilate our queer siblings into our societies, from the world, and from our own inhibitions. I now leave the floor open to the guest speakers, and going first, Shashikala Gurpur ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning to everybody, and I think it's good afternoon to the fellow speakers and all those who are joining us in this webinar. First of all, I should thank my dear colleague, Dr. Manika, and our gender champion, which is a very special activity within Symbiosis Law School, recently inaugurated as a best practice. And the faculty members who are advising the gender champions, and the leadership team of the students within the gender champions, as well as members who are also backed by our student advisory board, my dear colleagues, and other respected, esteemed guests who have joined us in the webinar. On behalf of the law school, I'm happy to welcome you. First of all, my presentation is going to be, I think, Manika, I have about 15 minutes, right? So in 15 minutes, I would like to go about this way. First of all, let me introduce to you the engagement of Symbiosis Law School, which you might not be familiar with, for last 13 years in this cause. Secondly, I would like to highlight what is the kind of salient feature of the law which is there in this relation. The Transgender Persons, I don't agree with the title of the act itself. Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, which was earlier a bill and now it's an act, which was passed in 2019. I'll give certain salient features. After that, I will give my critical reflections, and then from the point of view of human rights critique, and then I'll give my overall what you call expectation in this Pride Month in terms of how we could improve the situation of sexual minorities in our country. In my opinion, the appropriate title would have been sexual minorities rather than transgender, because the very word transgender in the popular movement or popularly known movement of the sexual minorities has been one of the categories. There are other categories as well. We call them LGBT. So for very long, that was a term of reference, and suddenly the legislation cannot narrow down. So I have dispute with the title of the legislation itself. And from the title, it's very clear that the transgender or LGBT movement was not involved closely in making this legislation. I can safely make that assumption. So with that little introduction, let me tell you how our law school has been involved. In 2007, when I took over, we got a very good opportunity of interacting with some of the, at that time we used to call them MSM communities. So MSM communities of Mumbai and Pune. Especially the underprivileged MSM community members in Pune were working as sex workers and small helpers here and there and beggars. So although they were reasonably educated, they had to make a living by begging. So we gathered them through this non-governmental organization from Mumbai and their collaborators in Pune, and we conducted a year-long weekend rights awareness program for them, so that they could negotiate their rights with the police. They could negotiate with their rights in terms of anybody who is violating their rights. And it was the first meeting itself was an eye-opener for us, the kind of ridicule that they face, the pain that they face, and the exploitation at the hands of the state itself. Once the state came to know that we did such a program, the State Resource Center collaborated with us, and we developed a toolkit, training toolkit. I have my colleague Abhijit here. I have, I don't know if Atmaram Shelke is here. He took a big lead. And Abhijit Deshpande, Ashish Deshpande, sorry, my colleague at that time was a student. He wrote his research piece also on that. So Symbiosis Law School engagement in this cause was as a facilitator, as a supporter, and as an advocate. So we believed in the advocacy of rights of the sexual minority way back then. So this was one of our agenda in our community legal service. And I must say that with their support and blessing, our community legal service clinic won the international accolade, national prizes, and now we are part and parcel of the District Legal Aid Services Authority. Second experience we have had is a very interesting experience indeed. We were invited to help this NGO in identifying boys who were facing such discrimination, and we had to intervene with them. Some of our students also were very actively involved with us in creating the dialogues and in creating the awareness, legal rights awareness. Third engagement of ours, which is the major engagement of any legal education institution, is the research. So I'm very humbled to place before you that we have had the first master's thesis way back in 2013. I myself guided this thesis in the wake of the third gender judgment about the surgeries, sex transformation surgeries that MSM or LGBT community members went through, and the kind of suffering and the kind of uncompensated injuries, medical injuries, non-medical injuries, precisely because of the stigma attached to this and the shame they faced whenever they went for medical aid or whenever they exercised their choice of belonging to any of the biologically determined gender. So we undertook, I had a student whose husband was working as a medical doctor. She was a daughter of a judge, so she had access to the medical and legal records. So we captured the case studies of a few people who had undergone such pain. So we created guideline on health rights of the MSM community, especially in case of sex transformation surgery. Thereafter, last year I had the privilege of guiding a student, Abhay Simha, and I connected him to a lot of activists in Bangalore, including our dear Akai, our friend. So Abhay was able to project how, despite the Navtej Singh Johar judgment, the LGBT rights were far from reality, and he was able to capture the survey in Bangalore because these people never wanted to come in front, so we coded and we protected their anonymity and privacy, and we conducted the survey. Where can we read this research? One of the articles has been published in one of the journals. The other two research are safe in our own college's research repository. We will give access if you want, or the gist we can pass on. So these have made us, and my experience of engaging with this alongside Dr. Jayamala committee's work on, where Akai was a member as well, work on sex workers in Karnataka, made us realize that we could not capture LGBT sex workers' reality within the generic sex workers' rights issues. Although the pains were the same, although the issues were the same, the most of the legislations were predominantly highlighting the gender pain experienced by women. So non-women, or those who are borderline, what we call as transgender, their pain was not easy to be captured in the narratives that we were taking. So there was a danger of these narratives being exceptional, these narratives being invisible, or being muffled by the dominant voice. On the other hand, MSM community or the LGBT community's issues were so complex that we made a recommendation. I created a big bold letters box item when we were presenting this report to the governor, that there is a need for separate study of LGBT sex worker community, because we had the Pune experience to guide us also in our resource sharing. So this is the little introduction I wanted to give you, that we could, it's no bold stand, it is no liberal stand, it's a necessary stand that we have taken, that gender champions need to focus aside from POSHA Act, aside from PWDA Act, because one of the flaws I saw in the Act was, the current Act which we are discussing today, 2019 Act, was that it stopped at talking about discrimination, it stopped at the fora, it did not look at the larger function, which I know from the reality of sanitizing gender equality related legislations. What is that sanitization? For example, if you have a POSHA Act definition, woman. If you look at rape definition, woman. There is a need for, I won't use the word gender neutral, there's a need for gender inclusive. That gender inclusive sentence, if they had put at least in the preamble or in the conclusion, the legislation would have done full justice. So in the beginning itself, I'm showing you how this legislation is a very myopic, narrowly focused kind of legislation. We as scholars of law, we have a very interesting statement that we make. We have political science experts here, sociologists here. We ask the question whether law is the initiator of social change or is it an indicator of social change. For me, this legislation is both. It is an initiator of social change, it's an indicator of social change. So with that pinch of salt, I would now invite your attention to the salient features of this legislation. Now, this legislation, as you know, the title is Transgender Persons, within brackets, Protection of Rights Act 2019. The year 2019 saw the transition of the bill into the act. And the prelude or the background to this act, as you know, would have happened in last decade almost, with the Delhi High Court's decision coming in this NGO case, and from there now it's in Johar case coming into the Supreme Court, in between the third gender definition case coming in. So all these hue and cry using the judicial platform would have made the legislators realize that this is an issue that cannot be ignored. However, this legislation, all of you know, came as a byproduct of a private member bill. I was watching the debates in the parliament. So there is a great credential to be given to this legislation. But often what happens when law is the initiator of the social change, if it initiates on a very weak note, there is a danger that that note remains unheard in music. So the music of transformation cannot begin with the weak note. Is this a weak note? My answer is yes, to some degree, because there's a lot of voice and lot of vigor we need to render to this legislation. So let me first introduce the very idea of definition. The very definition of the core of this legislation, the beneficiary, we say when we do the legislative analysis, what is the utility of the legislation, who is the beneficiary, what are the mechanisms. So we have a framework of analyzing the legislation and then anticipating which is the malady it is trying to prevent, which is the remedy it is trying to advance. In my opinion, the malady it is trying to prevent also will not be totally prevented. The remedy which it is trying to advance is to reach that beneficiary community. Most of their agonies have not been captured. So the legislation's impact, if not we are preempting, we can say that the legislation's impact needs to be reviewed. There is a mechanism within the legislation, a National Council for Transgenders, but that mechanism can also be utilized to build more rigor by amending this legislation. So many case laws may come up which may also make this legislation to be pushed forward in terms of its very purpose of reaching the transgender community. I would use the word sexual minority. So section 2K defines transgender person, means a person whose gender does not match with the gender assigned to that person at birth, and includes trans man or trans woman, whether or not such person has undergone sex reassignment surgery or hormone therapy or laser therapy or such therapy, person with intersex variations, gender queer, and person having such socio-cultural identities as Kinnar, Hijra, Aravani, and Jokta. I come from Karnataka, and in Karnataka we have Shiv Shakti, we have Jogappa, so there are many other vocabularies also. It's not captured in the legislation. They can say and any other cultural identification. And then whether or not such person has undergone sex reassignment surgery. So the definition provides for a broader category, but down below, when it comes to regulating the community, the sex reassignment surgery proof has to be produced and the magistrate has to certify someone as a transgender. Now, there is a inherent disagreement within the provisions of the legislation itself. So in this legislation, you will see that this is the debate that has come in Economic and Political Weekly, many media fora, that the very definition of the transgender itself is a problematic issue here because it is very narrowly cast. I would rather say it should be sexual minority because there are more and more identities emerging. I remember, if I can share with you, and it is a great background that we have here when we are critically evaluating this. The framework of critique comes from human rights parlance. We have the International Human Rights Convention. In that we have Yoga Karta principles, as you know. And within the International Human Rights Convention, we have got civil and political rights as a list of rights, and then socio-economic and cultural rights. And they were framed, first it came as a declaration, universal declaration, then they were framed into covenant on civil and political rights and covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. Now, within these, if you see, some of the human rights have been captured in this legislation, but some of the human rights have been forgotten. That is because those human rights have not been articulated within the Constitution's fundamental rights scheme also. So the agreement with the Constitution, the constitutionality of this legislation, the human rights conformity of this legislation are something to be debated by the community and others like us who are stakeholders in the legal system and the rule of law. Now, what is that problem? Let me tell you, we have had I have come across a case of a very wealthy family where the son was born, and as he was growing up in his 8th or 9th year, he realized that he cannot identify himself as a boy. So the way in which the family had alienated that person, the person went into a lot of problems. Fortunately, the father was a doctor and he intervened. And later on, this person was permitted to undergo sex transformation surgery. I had a classmate who was an athlete, and she used to be an extremely good athlete, and suddenly she disappeared from our community and her athletic performance was not to be read about. Their family migrated. So I was getting to know her only through newspaper items. Suddenly she disappeared into the oblivion. Then after some years, when I was trying to find out where is Rajivi, she has changed her name and she has become transgender, and she has now become a medical rep. Now, wherever family has been understanding, it's good. But what if that stage, that child was put out of the house because child is not listening, child is not conforming to what the family wants. So our research shows that family is the worst locale for sexual minority, because when they don't conform to the family definition of sexuality or sexually assigned gender, then they undergo a lot of trauma, disownment and abandonment. So it is in this context that the definition doesn't seem to do any justice and the scheme of the legislation. If you go to the third section of section 3, because section 2 in any legislation defines the terms, section 3 talks about prohibition against discrimination. So where all the prohibition against discrimination is tackled by the law, they say that including denial of service or unfair treatment. Denial of service and unfair treatment. If you ask me, discrimination in the international human rights parlance is far more wider. Exclusion. Exclusion is one. Hostility. So those terms are not captured. We have it in the POSHA. So this is where we don't seem to, when we define, our researchers or our legislative backup doesn't seem to be holistic. In one legislation, you look at it in one way. In another legislation, you look at it in another. Anyway, there they have captured discrimination in education, discrimination in employment, discrimination in healthcare, access to other services like goods, facilities, opportunities in public, right to movement, residing, renting, occupying property, opportunity to hold public or private office, access to a government or private establishment in whose care the transgender person is. Now, this is where we see that discrimination later on in one section is defined to be the target of a penalty as an offense. I have a problem here. I mean, if you look at the Nirbhaya legislation, ipso facto Nirbhaya legislation could be applied to the case of transgender, because this is the experience we have seen in Pune. This is the experience I was capturing when I was doing the exploitation dimension of sex workers in Bangalore. The way the police torture the minority, sexual minority, is unbelievable. I mean, if not worse, than the torture that others, women sex workers face, female sex workers face. So definitely, this legislation is not going to do, it's not going to address fully. It may address the civil rights dimension within the human rights parlance, but our society needs the cohesive criminal law approach as well if you want to have an effective approach to this issue. So this is my grouse here, which is not captured in newspapers or other analysis, because seeing the legal system overall as law professors, we feel that. Now there is another important section, section 5. It says that a person can avail benefit of this legislation if there is a certificate of identity. And who, first of all, identity is a very, if you look at the definition of identity, it is self-definition. And that self-definition is as articulated to others, can be known to others. Otherwise, it is something somebody wants to keep very private. And gender identity is a transitional identity. I have had friends who are heterosexual who have moved to become monosexual, and then so-called homosexual, and then they have become bisexual, then they have gone into free family. So there are multiple ways in which one's identity changes as one gets influenced, as one realizes the brainwave one undergoes. But the legislation has got a very static definition. Legislation says a transgender person may make an application to the district magistrate for a certificate of identity indicating the gender as transgender. A revised certificate may be obtained only if the individual undergoes surgery. How many of the sexual minorities are willing to come out in the open? I tell you my own experience of observing our female sex worker friends in Karnataka. Government came out with a scheme of self-employment for them and a grant. It doled out 20,000 rupees for a seed idea. And I tell you 0.02% success in the scheme, because they did not want to come out in the open and say they are female sex workers. I see same type of danger here, that you have to go and declare in a magistrate's court your identity. As it is, the sexual minority undergoes that repressed kind of feeling, and how many of them are willing to go to the public institution? So whether non-governmental organizations can come in, whether service providers can intervene, whether community organizations can facilitate this, can they be given a legitimate status to facilitate this? Is the magistrate guaranteeing in-camera proceeding? We have not made those changes in the Criminal Procedure Code. So the next generation law reform in this cause is what we have to foresee when we read this legislation and anticipating the working of this legislation. Another important provision among all the provisions here is the right of residence. Now, before I come to that, about this going to the magistrate and declaring one's identity is an issue that I would like to pause a little bit for 2 minutes. My experience of having read European human rights movement, the very first case on privacy was mooted in the case of decriminalization of homosexuality. India is talking now. Ireland is a very Catholic society and a highly rigid society where constitution itself begins with the invocation of the Holy Trinity. So there a law professor, Professor Norris, filed a case in European Court of Human Rights saying that this needs to be decriminalized. The whole, we also have in India the crime of the crime of so-called unnatural offences. Macaulay's criminal code had defined this. I mean, that was the first case that we had in Delhi High Court. So decriminalizing a claim when Norris made it under the human rights law, saying that one's expression of sexuality cannot be classified as natural or unnatural. It's violating the right to privacy. This argument was upheld, and the right to privacy jurisprudence in European human courts started with this case. So I connect that here, and some of the critics also have said in EPW and the newspapers that this is against the right to privacy. And in India now, right to privacy is no more a philosophical rhetoric. Right to privacy is a legal right now, which is recognized, I mean, more of a constitutional guarantee. That too, in the constitutional scheme of fundamental rights, the apex right of right to life is having the unenumerated part of right to privacy as it was declared or adjudged in the Puttaswamy case. That right to privacy is a sacrosanct right. So, and part of the right to life under Article 21. So, constitutionally speaking also, this legislation, when it was deliberated, we assume probably the right to privacy dimension was not taken into consideration while asking the person to go and declare. If at all it was taken into consideration, then there would have been check gates such as privacy being ensured by in-camera proceeding and voluntary. See, just like how in sexual harassment, when someone makes a complaint about under POSHA Act, do we first say that can this woman be trusted? We don't say that. So such trust should be there, and other antecedents should be taken into consideration, and that declaration and certification by the magistrate is something that seems to be in a way defeating the very purpose of the legislation by swaying away the beneficiaries. Another key provision that we need to highlight here is the right of residence provision under Section 12. Very interesting provision. Each transgender person shall have a right to reside and be included in his or her household. If the immediate family is unable to care for the very interesting, unable to care for the transgender person, the person may be placed in a rehabilitation center on the orders of a competent court. That means there are two implications. One is, if you don't want this person with you, it is very easy for you to go to the court, take a declaration and institutionalize that person. And why do we call it rehabilitation? This is not an illness. This person has all the capacity. The person has made, or person is having some kind of choice to either the choice or kind of convenience, I would say, to identify themselves as somebody who is not a dominant community. So when someone is not a dominant community, someone is a minority community, then it's very possible, it's very much possible that the whole mechanism of court of law and judiciary can be taken to a ride by somebody who has the power to do that. Therefore, I mean, we have seen this in case of mental health law as well, somebody being declared as lunatic and thereby advantage being taken of the property, etc., etc. So definitely this provision needs to be reviewed and it needs to be exercised with caution. Now I have given you the highlights because we have limited time. Let me quickly wind up. And now I also gave you the critique of human rights, but some of the important summary of what we have told. First of all, the very concept of family and intimacy here is envisioned from a dominant version, as if family is the family by blood tie. Because again, once again, the critique is reading it in terms of surrogacy or artificial reproductive technology usage. And current surrogacy bill smacks of this very rigid view. Somebody like Karan Johar had to go outside the country and adopt, get the child through surrogacy. So if somebody is belonging to this kind of sexual minority and if they want to make a choice of family, this legislation in a way reflects the blood ties, family by blood tie, family by conjugality, by heterosexual dominant version of marriage. So dominant version of family and dominant version of marriage, the minority or the diverse version of possibility of recreating and co-creating families. I'll give you an example. We had academic friends in England. Our Irish family had that, and the two lesbian couple and the gay couple, they were also classmates of my husband. So they both decided to go for ART and get a child and develop the child, grow the child between two families. So there were 4 parents. Look at the richness of the child. But then, you know, and one's sexuality is not necessarily the reflection of one's capacity to parent. So, and procreation is a natural right and urge. So they made that arrangement. It was possible contractually. Can we think of that in India? So this is where even the legislation, which is a ray of hope, seems to be going by the strong assumption of dominant version of heterosexual family and conjugality. In surrogacy, we have the conjugality as assumption because commercial surrogacy is prohibited now, and there is altruistic surrogacy which is highlighted. So this is where non-biological kinship network, the example I gave is a non-biological kinship network, which in a way gives a lot of social security, lot of emotional security to the minority, sexual minority community that doesn't seem to be occurring in the mind of the legislation here. Then, if somebody wants to create a family, legitimate family of choice, that scope is neither there in the surrogacy bill nor in this legislation. But if you look at our Indian Article 21, or if you look at Human Rights Convention, under both the covenants, right to family is implicit there, and African Human Rights Convention gives the right to family as one of the human rights. So if you have, I mean, these are some of the dominant features I have highlighted because of want of time. So I hope I have made my points very clear that what all of us who have assembled here need to do is cross the boundaries of our mind and watch it as the right of every human being. And this diversity enriching us, making us more sensitive, and giving us an opportunity to advocate for those who are minority and to unlearn our dominant idea of gender. Why I am using this term is, I remember in the Law Commission of India, I was discussing about making rape gender diverse. They said, what is this gender diverse? They said gender neutral. It can't be gender neutral. It has to be gender diverse because the experience of rape in the legislation is very physical experience and it is to a particular type of biological anatomy. Whereas we have experience of rape which has come into our awareness sessions with the MSM community, sex workers of a different type. Therefore, we need to, I think legislators will have to unlearn, we'll have to take the community opinion. One of the interesting points in the legislation is the National Commission for Transgender, and we have a whole lot of people there, right from the ministry. But interesting and good point is that they are going to take 5 members from the community, LGBT community. That's a good point. So this commission will be advising, monitoring the impact, and it will also open a grievance redressal window. Then the offenses are also identified of abuse, of slavery, of bonded labor, and sexual abuse, etc., emotional abuse, psychological abuse. All these are considered under the legislation and denial of place. My problem is you define the discrimination and you define offenses. What is the correlation between the two? This I didn't see. So our country needs a wholesome legislation on equality as such, and this legislation could go into the category of sexual minority rather than calling it only transgender, because categories have been renewing and emerging. And families are also, the very idea of family is also being co-created and recreated in the newfound freedom and in the newly imposed socio-economic and conditions driven by technology. Therefore, concluding, I would like to say that our idea of gender binary of male and female, our idea of dominant heterosexual marriage and family, and those which are not families, not marriage, not male, female. So we need to unlearn these, and understanding the another point is the common vulnerability. I gave you the examples. The common vulnerability of the cognate means equivalent of the female or equivalent of the weaker sex. Somebody, even in a homosexual relationship or heterosexual relationship, a physical male also may be violated by the physical female, or the vice versa, although dominantly the physical female becomes the target, or the rhetoric female. That's because of the patriarchy. So that patriarchal assumption which is operating behind this, the cognate of the weaker sex, equivalent of the weaker sex, is somebody who becomes a target of exploitation, pain and suffering, which is vulnerability. Because vulnus means a wound, which means the suffering, the harm. So we need to have a proper understanding of that, because those are the ones which are lurking behind the experience of the people at the ground level. So my appeal to the House is that let us study and look at next generation of reform, sanitizing other related legislations, throwing up research on that, getting into table the authentic experience of the community. So we request the community to cooperate also in such research as the authentic voice, and to move towards amendment of this legislation and reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gurpur ma'am, for those words. I think it was a very wholesome analysis of the bill and the act. So now I'd like to call upon Ms. Kalki to speak. But before we start with Ms. Kalki, I'd forgotten a very important detail about her, that she is also a founder of a very important NGO called Sahodri Foundation, which is dedicated to empower transgender people in India. And I believe that with such people coming to a panel and sharing their thoughts, it would be very enriching to this discussion. So I'd like to call upon Kalki ma'am.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present my views and opinions and thoughts on this important Transgender Persons Protection Act, which was passed in the Parliament recently. I should say that the previous speaker, Shashikala Gurpur, she was excellent in talking about almost everything in the Transgender Persons Act, and I think she has spoken enough of it. I would actually like to speak from the perspective of community person, as a trans person, as a victim of years of rejection. Just before that, I would like to talk about two things from the bill. One is Chapter 5, point 12, in Section 2, says every transgender person shall have a right not to be excluded from household or any part thereof. And it also says that where any parent or a member of immediate family is unable to take care of a transgender, the competent court shall by an order direct such person to be placed in rehabilitation center. this actually is so unacceptable by us. We cannot even accept this because it actually allows parents to reject a transgender child, reject a member of the transgender. If there is a member of that, if there is a member of the family who is a transgender, this point actually allows them to reject us from our home. And as Dr. Shashikala said, where is the need to put us into rehabilitation center? Rehabilitation center is for addiction and for anything else as such, for a person who was affected by something. But why should we be put in a rehabilitation center? So this actually shows the narrow understanding of the people, whoever has actually drafted the Transgender Persons Bill, and also it shows no amount of shouting from us has actually helped us in changing this. That is one thing. And I also wanted to talk about Chapter 8, point number 18. Whoever harms endangers the life of safe life. Whoever harms endangers the life, safety, health, or well-being of a transgender person, or lends them to acts including causing social abuse, sexual abuse, and economic abuse shall be punishable with imprisonment for a term which shall be less than 6 months, which shall not be less than 6 months, but which may extend to 2 years, and with fine. There is a problem with this because the harassment, the abuse, the rape, the kind of bullying that transgender people go through is almost every day. And from their parents, from their partners, sometimes from the place that they work, almost every day we actually face abuse. Since majority of the transgender persons are not well educated, don't even have a degree to hold, and a very respectable position in the society, and don't earn enough money or don't have enough education to stand up, to have the courage, to have the confidence to talk about their rights. This is absolutely victimizing. It gives an opportunity for the perpetrator to be more aggressive in the sense that the punishment against torture and the endangering the life of a trans person for their health, well-being is only 6 months to 2 years. It's unbelievable how trans bodies can be devalued so much. And how is it for cis women, biological women? How does abuse and ill treatment and harassment and rape considered, and how is the punishment for rape? We're talking about death penalty for rape, and why not? It is the same for people, the perpetrators of transgender person who actually rapes them, abuses them. Because I think the pain a biological woman or a child goes through because of rape and torture is as much as the same as what we go through, what a transgender person goes through. The pain, the tears, the blood, everything is the same. But why is the punishment is so less? It can extend up to 2 years only, and with fine. That really breaks my heart. This point really breaks my heart because I know I have been, right from my childhood, I have been a victim of bullying at school and at so many places I've been to. And I've been a sexual abuse victim at my college, in my hostel, where I was raped and then I was abused several times by many, almost like 50 to 60% of the hostel mates had actually, in a way or two, had somehow sexually abused me or tried to take advantage of me. So this is not a one-time experience for trans people. It is a lifelong torture, lifelong humiliation that we actually go through. And this kind of an insensitivity in the transgender protection bill is actually unbelievable for me, and it's heartbreaking. And it's not protecting. This act is actually, in that sense, it is not at all protecting us. And I have been, from our foundation, we have been doing the Red Wall project for the past 2 years, which is actually a project that addresses transgender violence. A team of us, 4 to 5 transgender people, including myself, we visit different towns around South India, and sometimes with our team members and partners in the other states also, we actually meet transgender community, gender diverse people. We interview them, we ask them, and we talk to them about the sexual harassment and abuse that happened to them. Every transgender person in this country has been abused at least once in their life, and that experience would be terrible. And for many people, it actually stays in our heart and in our life for a very long time, because we don't have the accessibility to go for a therapy or a counseling or to access a psychiatrist. And we don't have that knowledge to do it too. So that effect of rape, torture, bullying, harassment actually stays with us for a lifelong. We are never able to forget it, because over years, such experiences come again. Such abuses are repeated. So whoever has actually drafted this Chapter 8 has been insensitive, and no amount of shouting has actually helped in changing that. And that breaks my heart, because almost more than 500 transgender people, whoever we have interviewed, all of them have returned their stories in tears. And it is all about how they experienced abuse in the hands of their parents, in the hands of their partners, in the hands of their own family members, rejecting them, abusing them, sexually abusing them since their childhood. So it is not, it is terrible for us, especially as an activist, who has interviewed our community people, and we continue to do it. And it just shows the insensitivity of the people who have drafted this, because they have not spoken to the victims. They have not. And if they did, they wouldn't be taking the punishment this lightly, because we expect the punishment to be severe and not this much, this light. It's unbelievable for me. The majority of the transgender people I have spoken, they broke down, they cried, and in a way, for the past 2 years, it has actually psychologically affected all of us who were interviewing our community people, because it's almost the same, and we can feel the pain, we can feel the kind of experiences that our community went through. I've lived with my community for more than 5 years in Chennai. Though I was accepted by my family, I voluntarily left the family, and I lived with our community people for more than 5 years, and I've lived alone for another 5 years. In all these experiences, I certainly know that these chapters actually do injustice to our community. We need more. We need more justice. And this act is not really protecting us. In a way, it gives an opportunity for our families to reject. In a way, it actually acknowledges the abuse and the rape by the people, and it actually devalues our transgender bodies in a way that it doesn't really equate us with women and children who get raped and might go through the same kind of pain and experiences and the tears that we go through. and the lifelong side effects of all this that will stay with us forever in our lives. So that is what I would actually talk about in this. I'm not talking about my own perspective. I'm actually talking from an opinion of 500 transgender people who I have interviewed, our team has interviewed in the past 2 years. And my speech is actually the sum up, the collection of all their tears and their blood and their sadness and unhappiness and the pain. That is what I'm talking about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that speech, for your words, and all of us here empathize with you. And not only that, we also have understood this another perspective that trans people go through. And we're really thankful for you to come here and share these things with us. Complete solidarity from our side.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, because that is the kind of experiences we go through.
Yeah, I can see, I can understand, ma'am. Thank you
Yeah,
so much, ma'am. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Yeah. And now I'd like to call upon our last speaker of the day, last but not the least, Nacha ma'am. Narika ma'am. I'm so sorry. Narika ma'am. Um,
Yeah, hi.
oh, yeah. Hi. Hi, ma'am.
Uh, so I don't know if there's anything left to say because between Kalki and Shashikala, I think everything's been covered. The major problems with the bill, with the act rather, and what the community is facing, I think it's been covered fairly exhaustively. I just one point I think that needs to be made is that while we keep talking about the trans community in India, the larger issues of the trans feminine, the trans women, within which fall various subcategories and identities and lifestyles, carry some kind of there's a hierarchy within the community itself when we say trans community. And I think the larger issue of the trans masculine persons and the completely individualized within the community that the intersex persons who may identify or may not identify as trans, I think is completely overlooked, and therefore the bill doesn't even talk about the issues there. So I think that is a point that I wanted to make, and I think we keep hearing of things like corrective rape. We keep hearing things like electro conversion therapy and corrective rape and stuff like that. Yeah, and there's a term for this called curative violence, I think it's called, and there are a couple of people talking about it in some places, but I think the larger issue is not really covered properly. I think that is something, I think Kalki spoke a little bit about it in terms of what is the penalty for discrimination or penalty for violence against trans persons. Now, there's no 2,000 rupee fine or 5 months or 6 months in jail or something like that in the Act. When trans people are violently attacked on a daily basis in this country, the only fine is 2,000 rupees for basically, destroying a life. Someone can pay 2,000 rupee fine and get away with it. Where is the crime? Is the punishment equal to the crime? Is there a deterrent in society to stop violence against trans persons? These are things that are not being discussed. We keep talking over large perspectives, and I think those large perspectives are extremely important. In fact, discrimination, no reservation in education or health or in employment are things we need to make a bigger noise about. But also, I think that there is a clear which is sort of coded into the act itself and which is going to become law, is that trans lives don't matter as much as other people's lives. When the punishment for crime is 2,000 rupees fine. So I think that's the point I wanted to make.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am. I believe that even in like small words, you've encapsulated what you wanted to say, and I'm so glad you did, because again, complete solidarity from all of our sides of what you just said, and we completely have been enriched by that. So now it now ends the session right now. But before we end, we have a session of questions and answers that have been asked by our fellow students and other people. So I guess we can head to that. But because of paucity of time, I'll only be taking up 5 to 6 questions, which should be directed at either one of the panelists or to all of them. So there's this latest question. There you go. This is to the panel itself, which is: transphobia is extremely potent in our society, and there is gross misgendering that occurs against trans people on a daily basis. What legislations could be passed against this?
Does Kalki want to talk about it, or?
Any?
I think you can go ahead and talk, Nadika. It'd be lovely to hear your opinion.
Thanks, Kalki. So, misgendering occurs in various ways, and I think legislation is not the key there, right? How do you legislate things like, oh, you have to use Miss or Mrs. or Mr. or whatever? So what is the point of legislation like that? It's just one more extra loophole in law for people to get away with things, right? So I think the larger question is to, for society, for there to be some kind of social mechanism for building awareness and things like that, right? And so it starts with our own homes, starts with our parents, and starts with our family and extended WhatsApp groups and things like that, where we, there's so much misogynistic and sexist comments and jokes on WhatsApp groups all over. It's the same. The transphobia is a aspect of that. When we can make jokes about wife and husband and wife, all those kind of nonsense jokes on WhatsApp that keeps going around and nobody questions that, right? So you can't pass legislation to stop that, right? So awareness needs to happen at that level.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think the idea of transphobia, law can only achieve so much, and law is not enough. People are not going to change their ways and behaviors. And I think we need to build a social movement for this, right? And in many cases, misgendering happens when people don't know. It's not out of malicious intent all the time. I have faced this on a daily basis, right? And I can distinguish between malicious intent and ignorance or whatever. Right? So I can make the distinction, and I change my behavior accordingly. I think that needs to happen. Needs to have lots of public discourse about ideas of trans identities, trans lives, and trans behavior and sexual identities and things like that. One of the things that I found very useful for me is that there's this concept called the SOGI IESE, right? Sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Right? We keep talking of LGBTQI.
Yes,
The minute you say LGBTQI, you're putting one set of people away from the mainstream. Right? And then what happens? Oh, look at those poor people, they need rehabilitation. Oh, look at those sexual minorities. Oh, look at that MSM, right? So othering happens. They are different, we are the mainstream. So that sort of behavior, I think, needs to go, and language needs to adapt to things like SOGIs. Everybody has a sexual orientation. Everybody has a gender identity. Everybody has a sex characteristics. It's not just the queer people who are different, right? We all have variations and things like that. There's no such thing as this is the ideal man and this is the ideal woman. So I think larger community, and this is where allies will need to people like, almost everybody here on this call, I think, will need to come in and talk about these aspects of identities better. I guess that's...
All right. Thank you so much, Radhika ma'am. Kalki ma'am, Gurpur ma'am, would you like to add something to that?
I have answered all the questions which have been directed to me. I would request Kalki to come online and address some of the questions specifically addressed to her and also to Nadika. So please. Yeah.
I think Hannah has put up a question to me. How are we raising awareness about transgender rights in mainstream media and curriculum? I think in the mainstream media, a lot of us are already doing that. For example, I am doing it through art and activism, and Narika is doing it through that as well as writing. And many people, activists are doing it. And I think the years of activism from our ancestors, I may say, from our gurus and everybody, all those years they have done, we have taking it to the next step. I think that is what has made the change. If you see at the films where transgender people were represented 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was horrible. It was damaging, and it has actually damaged the community in many ways. And now, even though once in a while there are films that still damage community, the trans community, but the majority of the films have begun to be sensitive. The portrayals are beginning to be sensitive and more humane in portraying our community. And also in television, of course, I see many trans people appearing and talking about, and also doing shows. But there is one thing that is missing, is that lack of opportunities. That is what is missing for our community. We don't have, even though we are tremendously talented, we don't have the kind of opportunities that these people get. Because the discrimination in a way still exists, the stereotyping still exists. That could be the reason. But one thing is so important, that we need to actually educate our teenagers, our children, about be a trans, it's okay to be an intersex, it's okay to be a genderqueer, it's okay to be a gay or a lesbian. This is something that we need to educate children when they actually become in the beginning stage of their adulthood. We need to teach them to be tolerant. That is what we are missing today in our schools and in our colleges. Not only that, I see many professors in colleges completely ignorant on issues of gender and sexuality and trans rights. So we definitely need that. And of course, not only I'm talking about the students, we need a complete curriculum for all these educational institutions. I'm talking about teachers training institutions, where students actually study Bachelor of Education and Master of Education. They need to be taught about. Right now, we don't have education curriculum that actually teaches them, enlightens them, gives an awareness, and sensitizes them about gender and sexuality. If we wanted to change the next generation of people, of our children, to be more tolerant and to be more inclusive, that actually starts from the academic institutions. That is where we need to begin. And I think that is what we are missing today. We are talking about, for years and years, we are talking about discrimination. We are at a very early stage in schools and in colleges. We are not making that change. And that is what is so pathetic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. Yeah, it is true that anything.
So that's one point, Kalki, which I missed in my presentation, making reservations. You know, special provisions. We have So I have an argument that Article 14 also needs to be sanitized. Discrimination based on sex, it is written. It has to go into the word gender. And then we have to go to special provision shall be made, I say, vulnerable. So this is my new argument which I've been parroting everywhere. So we could add there. Then reservations in, I mean, here we are telling protection against discrimination. So that is a kind of what we call as penal approach. Where is the constructive approach? The constructive approach is to make provisions, as you said, providing opportunities, equal opportunities, access. So in all those places, the legislation doesn't speak much about that.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. It is true that all changes need to be institutional first and then any other
There are
steps.
some more questions, moderator. So would
Yes,
you
ma'am.
read it to, I think Kalki has received a few more questions.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to be reiterating.
Yeah,
them.
there's a question by Yashona Sarkar,
Yes.
Manika this side, for Kalki, that how do we emphasize that a sexual or gender identity is not a choice, but an integral part of the persons themselves? It has been an argument in denying the humanity of a trans identity, as well as the body on grounds of biology, as well as supposed defiance of familial views. This is addressed to Kalki, if
Kalki,
she
ma'am.
may. Yeah. Or if Nadika would like to take it.
It's open to the whole panel, honestly.
I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but so the thing is, I think self-determination is one of the foundational beliefs in law. I think, right? And we talk about democracy as the consent of the governed, and we talk about lots of things about self-determination and consent. And I think law that does not take into account self-determination is inherently weak. And so we can't do any amount of, you can't put any layers and clauses on top of something that doesn't understand self-determination. And I would also like to say that this idea of inherentness is important for us to recognize, but also the choice of being whatever we want to be, right? And so a lot of times we activists go into biological essentialism for things like sexual orientation or gender identity, but it is not only the biological essentialism. There is a choice on that also, right? And if we don't talk about those things, I think we are losing the fight for peace.
Absolutely. We have an argument, standpointism and biological determinism, and the way in which you have to go. Biology is not destiny, kind of argument.
And more and more intersex, and I am an intersex person myself, right? So I more and more intersex discourse and intersex research into intersex variations and sex characteristics are showing that even biological sex is not a binary. It is, even biological sex is a spectrum. It is not just gender, which is a social construct. Sex is also a social construct, and sex is determined often at the surgical table or at the delivery room by the doctor in 2 seconds time by a very cursory examination of newborn fetus, right? So where is the idea of choice there? Where is the essentialism is biological essentialism or male or female is forced upon people by a doctor who's not seen you or who says you have no say in this matter. Right? So I think we need to talk a lot more about those things also. Choice is important. Biology is there, but biology cannot be our spokesperson.
Absolutely. That's right.
A very important question by Ahana again to Nadika. It is addressed to you. That your online articles have been very well received, especially focusing on trans rights. Do you think, however, that there's a huge gap in between support and recognition online and in the real world?
Actually, yes. I think what happens is the online world that we build in, the community we build is self-selected, and therefore we choose people we like and support each other and things like that. So there's a lot more support online, right? And there's lots more belief. And we're also talking to a rather elite set of people who have education, who have access to the internet, who have access to exposure to global discourse and things like that. So that is determining a lot of support I get online. Offline, maybe not so much, because of obviously there's a diversity of opinions offline that I don't filter out. And like I said before, I think partly the reason is that we can't legislate social behavior. We can only have a law that says that provides for some recourse against certain social behaviors, but we can't say that this behavior cannot happen. To a certain extent, right? We can say, it's crime to steal, but you can't stop the thief from actually stealing something. You can then find justice for that person who suffered that burglary or whatever. So, social mores and social behaviors will need to be changed by activism on the ground, by by education and awareness campaigns, and by people talking to each other. I suppose at the end of the day, someone said, "Love in law is justice," or something like that, right? I'm not sure exactly what the quote is, but I think we need to have that conversation with lots more people. We need to build that kind of dialogue in the world, in the real world, and it is difficult for trans people to do this all the time. It's difficult for queer people to do this all the time, and that's where allies will need to step in. Because half the time we are fighting for our lives and for our livelihood, right? For 6 months of the year, I'm unemployed because nobody wants to give me a job. I do a project and then I wait 6 months more for the next payment to come. Right? At that time, I can't go around doing activism and fighting for my rights because I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow. Right? So it's at that point that we need allies to step in and say, hey, listen, what you're doing is wrong, or you need to look at people better, or you need to talk to us better, and things like that. And this conversation cannot be one way; that needs to happen over and over again.
Yeah. I think I suggest there are very good responses from Darshan Bhaiya, then Bhavya Upadhyay. Shreeya has a suggestion, which I responded. I said that it should be part of the sex education. Ankita Dash, wonderful question. Then we also have Ahana asking another question. So will you take up those Bhavya's response, please?
Yes, sir.
Can you see that?
Yeah. So the question is addressed to both Kalki and Nadika, that the CIS community often takes up very tokenistic and patronizing methods to show support for the community. What, according to you, are few areas that allies from the CIS community can work on, and what is the right way to approach it in the social environment? We want to hear from both of you.
Yes, sir.
Maybe first I'll go.
Yeah.
I think the number one thing is to unlearn your whatever stereotype notions that you have on trans people. The first thing is to unlearn all that wrong notions that you have. The second thing is to actually, everything begins at home. I think we should start from educating our families, our friends, and our co-workers in understanding and accepting of LGBTQI people, including trans people. And if you really wanted to show support, I think you can, in everyday life, it is possible. You can be a volunteer for organizations and show your support. You can write about it. You can show your support through social media. You can visit organizations and get involved in action-oriented projects that actually make results. And there are many other ways that you can actually do it. I think from your student of law, you can do much more than anybody else. In that you can actually get a better understanding about the situation of trans people legally in our country. And I think you can work towards making it better. That is one thing I would like to say. And is there any other questions?
Yes, yeah, there are a few more. I think we can do 2 or 3 more.
You can do Ida, Hannah, and Shreedevi, I think.
I would also like
yes,
to say one more thing is that one of, I think one student or somebody who said, yeah, wouldn't it be better? I think it was Shreeya. Wouldn't it be better to educate children about LGBTQI at school level? In a way, knowledge of this is better inculcated and interpreted as they grow up, giving the youth a clearer picture and less misunderstanding and fear about LGBTQIA. There are still many who fear and hate the unknown within the reason or the slightest effort to understand it. Of course, this is what I covered previously a few minutes ago about educating the educators, educating our children at the school level, and also educating our educators on addressing their ignorance on gender and sexuality, and including including education and knowledge on LGBTQI rights and education on gender and sexuality. And particularly 2 years ago, we actually designed a book. I wrote a book. It's actually called as, in Tamil, we wrote it as Palinam Unara Iyalada, Palinam Urdi Paditha Iyalada Manavar Patriya Asayirkana Kayir. It means that a teacher's guide to gender this is the book. A teacher's guide to gender non-conforming children. So this actually, I wrote it for teachers, not for students, because I think a teacher can actually make a very big change at school if she is very well educated. So this is intended for teachers. So that is what we need to be. Not only should we educate our students, our young people today, we need to educate our teachers because they will make a big change in the classrooms.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. There is another question that has come, which is from Stuti. So it's to both of the panelists, all 3 of the panelists actually. So it says, recently the Equality Act, an LGBTQ plus civil rights bill, which aimed to amend the US Constitution and add LGBTQ plus people to the protected class so they can't be denied the right to healthcare, housing, or even credit, was blocked by the Senate. What are some of the basic rights that trans people are denied of that you think should be added to a hypothetical Equality Act if it was to be passed in India? And,
yeah, I think we've spoken about it throughout this call, right? Throughout this webinar, we've spoken about the shortcomings of the Trans Act itself, and how it does not allow self-determination. It does not look at, the original NALSA verdict in 2014 is probably one of the most progressive judgments in the world when it comes to trans rights. And then we went from there to what now the act is such a slip. We've just gone, not only have we fallen down the hill, we've dug a hole and gone further in from what the NALSA judgment was. I think if we just stick to what the NALSA verdict was, I think it's one of the, yes, obviously some of the definitions in the NALSA judgment are, not great, but that's because of the time and the people who were involved in the case. I think using that and some of the later definitions that have come out, and all the issues that we are pointing out with the bill, with the act right now, I think that will be your Equality Act. I think there is a lot to be said about, the Prevention of Atrocities, the SESP, Prevention of Atrocities Act itself covers a lot of the violence that we face. I think there is not much talk in the trans community of, oppression of caste-based oppression, caste-based violence within the trans community. I think some of those dialogue should be taken into account, because a lot of how to put this politely, right? And a lot of the people who are visible as trans activists have caste privilege, who enact laws or do activism that helps them from a position of privilege. But the majority of trans people do not have that caste privilege. I think so. Therefore, some of the aspects of the Prevention of Atrocities Act should be brought into the Equality Act that we're talking about here.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. So it seems as if we may not have any more questions, but I do have a personal question that I wanted to ask all the three panelists. So it so happens that in an institute, like an educational institute, there are few people who are still closeted, either trans people or genderqueer people. So how do they ensure their own safety and try to incorporate these identities into the, there are certain administrative proceedings that are involved when you're in a college, like, form filling and everything. So how does one go about feeling safe in their educational institute and also somehow ensure that their identity is not only preserved but also respected, and there is no misgendering or any sort of those things? How do we create those spaces? Because even, for example, even in this college, we have gender champions, which aims at exactly doing what I said. But what other steps could we take apart from, cells or any other activities? Because I think a lot of things have already been covered, but like sometimes there's also this question of fear or safety, because something's left out, that they're left out. So, I mean, if there's any answer to that.
I haven't been in an educational institution in a really long time, so I don't know what the current dynamics are. But I think groups like yours, the gender champions, I think should take up the, take up the cause further. I think this in Bombay had said that some of the hostels will be gender neutral and some of the restrooms will be gender neutral and things like that. So I think there is a lot to be said for campus activism. Have more events, talk to people, maybe talk to a counselor or a therapist and offer mental health counseling sessions every, let's say, every fortnight for people who want it, and no questions asked. Make it completely anonymous, so no one knows who is getting counseling for what, and so that opens up, that offers some kind of support, right? And I think the most important thing is that we say that we do not pass judgment on people. I know it's difficult as human beings, especially as human beings who live in a very judgmental, caste-based, class-based society such as India, right? To instantly judge other people's choices. I think that's where we make the first change, is that we say everybody is welcome, and I don't know, these sound very open-ended and vague and high level and superficial, but I think that's where it starts, right? For instance, one of the things that I talk to a lot of people and say, don't say you're inclusive, say you're non-discriminatory or non-exclusive. Because what is inclusion from one person? How do you cover all the identities that are out there? Even if you're extremely well-intentioned, you're going to leave some people out. Right? So I think that's one practicing kindness and compassion is important. Being sympathetic is important. I think those are things that we should all look at.
Hi, Manika. Yeah, Manika this side, and because Kalki has already featured in a movie, and I belong to Aligarh, and till my post graduation, I did my post graduation from Aligarh Muslim University, and I think all of us know about Professor Ramchandra Siras, who was in a way, I'll not use any other word than murdered by the Aligarh Muslim University's community. And I remember that particular time I was there in the university getting my education, living with my family, and the kind of media coverage was given in the local Hindi newspapers, which are read by local people only, and there was no inquiry set on his death. After a few days, he was found dead in his newly moved apartment, and although he won the case, but he left us. And also, so somewhere down the line, I think it's not a question, but I think the mental health of the community is also something which is very superficially acknowledged and addressed. And as our director ma'am clearly pointed out, that how the right of residence has such a confusing word, that is the rehabilitation center. Now, rehabilitation center in the journal parlance is used for if you are suffering from something, if something can be cured. But you know that the insensitivity of the language also, which has played a major role in the act. Also, I would also like to raise a question, because there was a question on the portrayal of the community in the media. So I think it's been a year or so. I watched a fabulous movie called Super Deluxe, in which it was a superb movie in which Vidya Sethupathi plays the role of a trans person. My question is that why can't we have the real trans person playing the role? You know, when we will get to that. For example, there was such a hue and cry when Priyanka Chopra played Mary Kom in Mary Kom. You know, why somebody not from Northeast can play Mary Kom. But we had no such kind of hue and cry regarding this particular movie. Although I still believe that the movie is really excellent. So I think that's my submission, and yeah, I kind of question also to the panel. Yes. If Kalki can speak on that, because she has been in media, and is Kalki with us right now?
Kalki ma'am?
I think she's disconnected. If Nadika can say a few words or address it.
Not particularly. I think we've spoken enough about that. So I should say that I really like the film Super Deluxe, and I think Vidya Sethupath's performance was fantastic, and the film itself is very sympathetic. I don't really have. Yes, it would have been fantastic if we found the director asked a trans woman to play the role. And this is will be coming in for, I don't know, whatever it is. But again, I think it goes back to larger social concerns, and that there is not enough of a dialogue outside closed ivory tower sort of academic circles on what representation means. I think that's about. I think, and that's where a lot more discourse needs to be built on these topics.
Yeah.
All right, ma'am.
Are there any more questions? Because we have some time.
Yeah, there is one question by Bhavya. So it's for Nadika ma'am, but obviously Gurpur ma'am and Kalki ma'am are invited to opine on this as well. So within the queer movement, there's a sidelining of certain identities. This extends to broader feminism. So should advocacy look at establishing equality, or looking at specific protections for specific forms of discrimination that one may face. For instance, intersex people require protection against surgical intervention at a young age. It's like an example. So, would Narika ma'am, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
It needs to be both. The fight for justice cannot be, okay, I will address problems as they come up. The fight for justice has to be two-pronged. You need to talk about larger issues. We need to fight discrimination at the larger level. And you also need to address specific shortcomings. And so it needs to be both. I can't say, oh, okay, today we'll only talk about trans people, and then once we achieve that, let's go after intersex issues. I can't do that, right? It needs to be simultaneous. It needs to be sustained. It needs to be long term. So I think saying can we do this versus that is not an issue. We need to do both.
There's a very interesting question by Tarun on whether patriarchy prevails even in this community. My answer is yes, because reports are saying that.
Yeah.
Yes. Regarding surgeries also, I did not tell the full picture because of want of time, but I just diverted the attention to healthcare. In the Equality Act in the US, they are bringing this provision, but Senate had blocked it. That reveals the hypocrisy of US politics as well. But if you are looking at healthcare, there is a whole lot of reform needs to be done. You know, the corner quack advertising about healing certain things, and these people secretly going and spending a lot of money, getting emotionally exploited, economically exploited. So because of the lack of awareness and because of the acceptance by the society of these kinds of things. So healthcare system needs to be, what we need to do is destigmatize the whole thing and give a place of honor and dignity, most important, privacy and dignity. So unless we make it a culture, and that culture has to be both at home and in public sphere, only then I think the difference will be felt.
All right. There was actually a correction. The last question was asked by Ishika and Madhavya. But moving on, there is another question by Malika for Nadika ma'am, which says, shouldn't there be subsidies for medical expenses for gender reassignment surgery, since the Act emphasizes it so much, but no concrete measures have been taken for accessibility of such medical procedures?
Definitely, I think so. I definitely think we need state support and subsidies for gender reassignment and gender transition surgery and hormones and things like that. In fact, I would go one step further, and we should say that healthcare itself should be public good and socialized medicine across the board for everybody. Given that we don't have that system yet, I think there's definitely be some support for trans. In Tamil Nadu, there is subsidies for surgery and hormones for trans people, but obviously because the medical system there is overloaded, there's a big waiting list, and so I think Pondicherry also has some support. I think Kerala offers some support. I don't know if Maharashtra offers, but I think there is a conversation happening with some activist circles in Maharashtra to push for subsidies for surgery in different states. So I think yes, we should definitely have it.
All right. I think there aren't any other questions. If there are any other questions by the participants, please put it down, or you can come on the speaker.
If there are any other comments, concluding comments from any of the panelists, we welcome. If any of the panelists want to say something, add to the discussion, we welcome that. Okay, now I request request Sudipta, Professor Sudipta Chakrabarti, to give the vote of thanks. And I thank Shreeya for moderating the session so well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Is Sudipta Chakrabarti on board? Is online?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Manika. As usual, it was a huge amount of, very painful pleasure to listen to what the panelists had to say, the topic being what it is. It's enlightening, it's heart-wrenching, it's so much more than hearing personal stories and how the law needs to keep up to address these stories of human suffering. Thank you, Dr. Shashikala Gurpur ma'am, for your introduction. As always, it was beautiful to hear you talk about any legislation for that matter and something like this from the point of view of human suffering. What baffles me in this act is the extraordinary amount of power which a government officer still has in his hand to arbitrate which trans people actually qualify. So right at the entry point of this legislation, we find the state again standing there as a gatekeeper. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your personal experiences in this area, the research work you have done, and taking us through the legislation. Thank you to our dear panelists, Ms. Kalki. I think it was beautiful to hear your story. Sometimes the stories are lost in how we whitewash everything with one brush of social acceptability. And when invisible stories of pain and suffering get a face, they become personal, they become individual, and they start impacting in a way which no whitewashed story can. So to have a face of someone who has been at the receiving end and to hear that story and the interpretation of a statute from the point of view of somebody who's at the receiving end of it has been a beautiful experience for me. And similarly for you, dear Ms. Nadika, hearing you talk about your experiences and how you critique the law and what you have experienced as a trans person, it's enlightening. It makes us realize how many pain points and how many touch points does a legislation like this have for people who are supposed to be protected and whose lives are supposed to be positively impacted by these legislations. Dr. Manika and Professor Preeti, thank you so much, our faculty members for the Gender Champions, for organizing this, a beautiful topic, wonderful panelists. It was very, very enlightening for someone like me interested in the topic to hear it from such eminent panelists. Our dear students, Bhavya, Sakshi, Suma, Devyani, Tamanna, Ashwin, Ardom, Nandita, Ahana, Varshini, Pragya, Shreya, Preetam, Soumya, Malika, thank you so much for all your enthusiasm and for believing in something like this. You do not join something like Gender Champions because it looks good on your CV. It comes from the heart, it's a calling, and I thank all of you for choosing to stand by causes which are important to us as human beings. Thank you, everybody, and it was a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Sudipta.
I thank Sudipta for delivering such a heartwarming vote of thanks. So, on the behalf of Gender Champions, Legal Skills, Symbiosis Legal Skills Center, Human Rights Cell, Symbiosis Law School Pune, I would like to thank everybody who came on board, our audience, our panelists, our student volunteers, and everybody for celebrating. This was our way of celebrating and acknowledging and addressing the Pride Month. And I thank everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Pride Month. Yeah.
Happy Pride Month. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy Pride
Bye.
Month, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.